Water, Apple.
You sad?
In the misty forests of Snoqualmie Valley, late 1980s, biologist Sarah Hartley stumbles upon something impossible. A trembling creature under the spring rain. It's a baby Bigfoot, barely the size of a toddler, with eerily human features and eyes that seem aware. She names him Echo. At first, Echo mimics everything. Zippers, birds, even Sarah's size. But then, he says apple. Not copied, spoken, like he understands. That night, the forest roars with a deep, thunderous sound. Something out there is searching. Weeks pass. Echo speaks like an old soul in a fuzzy little body. But he never asks questions. Not one. Until one night, as Sarah sketches the daughter she lost, Echo touches the page and gently asks, "You sad?" That moment shattered every boundary between human and creature. Echo wasn't just mimicking. He felt. And when he whispered her daughter's name, Sarah knew. This was no monster. But the forest remembers everything. Giant claw marks, massive footprints circling their tent, a scarf from the 1960s with the name Caleb, Nev's lost grandson. Turns out, Bigfoot didn't harm him. They tried to protect him. As snow blankets the valley, Echo begins to hear the call of his kind. And Sarah must choose. Reveal the truth to the world, or protect something too sacred to expose. What would you do if you've ever lost someone? If you've ever wished the world could understand your silence? This story will speak to you. And now, dear viewer, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? What's your name so we can say hi properly? And how far do you think this story of compassion could travel? Drop a comment, give a like if your heart stirred even just a little, and subscribe to join our growing community that believes Bigfoot isn't just a myth. He might be the most misunderstood heart in the forest. From us to you, thank you for being here. The mist clung low to the forest floor like a secret not ready to be told. In Snoqualmie Valley, spring never arrived in grand declarations. It seeped in, slow, wet, unceremonious. The ferns glistened with moisture from the drizzle that had fallen since midnight. Moss curled around tree trunks like ancient shawls. A red-tailed hawk cried in the distance, lost in the gray sky that blended with the treetops, and somewhere deeper in the forest, a branch cracked under something heavier than a deer. Sarah Hartley didn't flinch. Her boots sank half an inch into the muddy trail, and she adjusted the strap of her field bag with the same tired motion she'd repeated 100 mornings before. Binoculars around her neck, notepad sealed in a Ziploc. Flask half full of black coffee and rainwater now, probably. Her breath came slow and even. She moved like someone who had learned to let the forest pass through her rather than push against it. 10 years in, she didn't scare easy. Not anymore. She crouched, inspecting a fresh paw print pressed deep into the clay near a split tree. Ursus americanus, black bear, subadult, based on width and gait. She noted the weight distribution, left foot heavier, limping maybe. It had been here last night, not long before the rain picked up, probably seeking water. She jotted it down with mechanical precision, and yet, under all her professional calm, something tugged at the edges. Not fear, not excitement either. Something quieter. A tension she couldn't name. A hum in the back of her mind, like an orchestra warming up before the first note. The woods were too quiet. No crows, no wind through the canopy. Only the soft hiss of mist kissing pine needles. She adjusted her jacket zipper. A second later, behind the rotted base of a cedar tree, something echoed it back. Zip. She froze. It wasn't loud. Just faint enough to doubt. Could have been a rodent. Wind, maybe. But then came the sound again, this time unmistakable. Zip, slower, deliberate, imitated. Sarah turned slowly, heart rate unchanged, but breath caught. Her hand found the binoculars, but she didn't raise them. Instead, she took one step closer to the overgrown patch of sword ferns curling near the log, her boots sinking deeper now in the wet earth. One knee down. She parted the foliage gently. The moment stopped breathing. Nestled beneath the curve of the ferns was a small, hunched shape, no larger than a toddler. Its fur was matted and dark russet, soaked through in parts, clinging to slender arms and knees drawn tight to its chest. But what stunned her into stillness wasn't its size or condition. It was the face. Not animal, not quite human, not ape. Something older. The brow was sloped but expressive, the skin a deep brown under the hair. The eyes, impossibly large, wet, unblinking, stared back at her not with fear, but recognition. It opened its mouth and made a sound. Not a growl, not a cry, a breathy whisper. Mimicked. Zip. Like a zipper. Sarah stayed still. Then slowly she reached for her water flask. The creature's eyes followed the motion like it understood. When she tilted the flask slightly, letting droplets spill onto the moss, it reached one hand forward, slow, careful, as if not to startle her. Then it whispered again, this time more urgent. Wah, wah! Her breath caught. Not just sound, not just mimicry. It knew the word, somehow. Her field training screamed at her to call this in. Log the sighting, snap a photo, contact base, don't touch, don't interfere. But her hand moved on its own. She slipped off her jacket and wrapped the creature, the child, in it gently. It was trembling. The fur was soaked, and underneath the warmth of it, she could feel a heartbeat, rapid and faint. Its breath steamed against her collarbone as she cradled it against her chest. She didn't remember walking back to the field tent. The rain had picked up by the time she zipped the canvas door shut behind her. The radio crackled in the corner. Sarah sat down, jacket still wrapped tight around the little being now curled in her lap. Her fingers hesitated above the dial. Cascadia Base, this is Hartley. Over. A pause. This is Hartley. I found the track line. Bear's been through the area, but no further anomalies. Over. Her own voice felt hollow. She turned the dial down and looked at the small thing sleeping against her. Fur damp. Lips parted. One hand gripping the zipper of her coat like it had always known it. It didn't belong here. And yet, somehow it did. She named it Echo. That night, long after the forest faded into darkness, something knocked in the distance. Not a tap, a thunderous step. A sound that rolled through the valley like weight against the earth. Sarah turned off the lantern. Outside, the mist moved like a breath too large to belong to anything human. Down in town, 62-year-old Nev Calder, owner of Nev's Baked Goods, paused mid-sweep of her shop's porch, staring out at the ridgeline. She felt it too. Not the sound. The shift. Like a thread being pulled tight across the trees. Something had changed, something had crossed a line, and when she thought of Sarah, alone out there in that damn research tent, she frowned. That girl was hiding something. Back in the forest, hours later, the storm picked up again. At dawn, Sarah unzipped the tent just enough to breathe in the cold air. She found herself whispering a word she hadn't said in years. Please. Behind her, echoes stirred and made a sound. It was the faintest echo of a sigh. It sounded like the child she'd lost a decade ago. She bit down the thought before it could grow teeth, but the forest had already heard it. Mid-morning, she heard tires crunching gravel. An old green truck pulled up near the tree line. Otto Briggs, long-retired fire lookout and forest eccentric, stepped out. He wore a waxed canvas coat, patched jeans, and an expression like he'd already seen what she was hiding. Without knocking, he lifted the flap of her tent and stuck his head in. You're not the first to bring something strange out of these woods, he said. Sarah didn't answer. She was still frozen in place. Echo curled against her side like some strange question. Otto looked down at the bundle, then back up at her with quiet finality. I saw one, long time ago. Didn't end well. He tapped the side of his head once. Memory's a funny thing. Forrest, don't forget. You can lie to the center. Hell, you can lie to yourself. But if that thing out there's calling for him—" He looked over his shoulder toward the trees. "It ain't gonna stop." Sarah stood as he left. Echo stirred in her arms. Then, as if to remind her what was at stake, it sat up and looked into her eyes and said one word. Apple. Not a repeat, not a mimic, a word spoken with intention. She didn't know how it had learned it. She didn't care. Outside, the ground shook again. The forest was coming, and Sarah, for the first time in her disciplined, regulated, peer-reviewed life, chose to lie. She chose the child. The sun hadn't broken through the clouds in days, but the forest had learned to live with gray. Low light filtered through a lacework of branches, casting soft shadows across the clearing where Sarah had staked her tent. The spring rains had slowed, but everything still dripped. Everything still smelled of mud and cedar. Echo was already awake. She didn't know how he always rose before her. No alarm, no sound. Just that same posture each morning. Crouched at the edge of the tent flap, wrapped in her old flannel jacket, staring out as if waiting for something he remembered but couldn't name. His fingers moved with a kind of absent-minded rhythm, drawing lines in the damp dirt or tapping his knuckles in sequence against the canvas. Sarah had started to keep notes, not because she had to, but because it helped her hold onto a thread of logic. It was the only thing she still trusted. Mimicry, confirmed. Memory retention, abnormal. Emotional awareness, unknown. Language capacity, expanding. Moral judgment, inconclusive. But she couldn't write down the most important line, the one she thought about every time Echo looked up and smiled at her with those wide, knowing eyes. He wasn't just repeating, he was choosing. That morning, she left him with a handful of trail mix and an old walkie-talkie with the batteries long dead. He liked the way the static sounded. She caught him once mimicking it back, twisting his mouth into soft bursts of crackling noise. When she returned with water from the creek, he was holding the device to his mouth and whispering, "Stone, tree, sky." Simple, soft, clear. It stopped her cold. He saw her and beamed. She crouched down, heart hammering beneath her coat. "Where'd you hear those?" Echo touched the walkie-talkie, then touched his ear. Then he pointed at her, gently. "You say, I say," and then he laughed. It wasn't the high-pitched squeal of a monkey or the guttural bark of some wildling. It was a child's laugh, warm, round, familiar. Too familiar. Sarah stumbled back, face blanching. It was the same laugh her daughter had made, years ago, at the base of the slide in that park in Kirkland. The same note, the same hiccup at the end. The memory hit like a blade to the chest. She dropped her canteen. Echo flinched, shrank into himself, then reached forward and handed it back with slow fingers. "You okay?" he asked, voice small, still learning. She nodded but couldn't speak. Later that day, when Nev showed up with a basket of blueberry muffins and 2 jars of her famously aggressive apple butter, Sarah almost cried. She didn't expect company. She didn't want any. But she also didn't want to be alone with what she was starting to feel. Nev stood at the edge of the clearing, squinting at the tent flap, then turned her gaze to Sarah like a sniper might scope wind direction. "You look like you ain't slept in a week," she said. Sarah forced a smile. "Bear tracks, kept me on edge." Nev wasn't buying it. Her hands were still flour-dusted, and her apron had a little cartoon elk stitched into the corner, faded from 100 washes. She looked like kindness in a bottle, but her gut was sharp. "You hear something weird last night?" Nev asked, offering the muffins without looking directly at her. Sarah hesitated. "Just wind." Nev tilted her head. "Wind ever sound like footsteps to you?" Sarah didn't answer. Nev let the silence settle like dust before turning toward the tent. "What's that noise?" From inside, faint but rising. The sound of a child repeating the phrase, "Sky, stone, wah-wah, laugh, wah-wah." Nev's face shifted. She didn't say a word, but Sarah saw her fingers tighten on the handle of the basket. "I found a radio in the woods," Sarah lied. Something got stuck on the channel. Nev nodded slowly. Funny. Sounded just like my grandson did when he was little. Said wah wah just like that when he wanted his cup. A crack opened in the air between them. Neither moved. Nev placed the basket gently on the ground, dusted her hands, and turned to go. You let me know, she said without turning around. If you need help with anything strange. Sarah didn't breathe until the old truck was gone. That night, after Echo fell asleep with his head on the sleeping bag and one hand curled protectively around the walkie-talkie, Sarah unzipped her field journal and started sketching. Not data this time, not findings. She drew 3 faces, hers, her daughter's, and Echo's. The resemblance made her hands shake. Later that week, a shadow moved past her tent near dusk. She caught a glimpse of it between the trees, just a flicker. When she stepped outside, flashlight in hand, she found footprints in the soft mud leading around the clearing. Smaller than hers, but larger than Echo's. Youth-sized. She followed them. 100 feet away, behind a downed alder, she spotted him. Marshall Denny, age 15, local smartmouth, son of a part-time hunter, full-time rumor mill. He crouched low, breath fogging, hoodie pulled up, eyes wide. "What the hell are you doing?" Sarah hissed. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Is that thing in there a monkey?" Sarah stepped forward, firm. "Go home." Marshall didn't move. "I didn't tell nobody," he whispered. "I swear. I just heard something. It sounded like a kid." He looked down at his shoes. "And I thought maybe," she softened, just for a second. "Maybe what?" He shrugged. "Maybe it was a kid." Then he ran. When she came back to the tent, Echo was drawing something on the inside wall with a dull stick of charcoal. Little lines, crosshatches, shapes. He looked up when she entered and smiled faintly. Then, as if showing her something private, he held up a thin scrap of bark. It was carved, not deeply, but carefully. Lines intersecting in a pattern that reminded her of a dream catcher or an abstract sun. It wasn't scribbled. It wasn't random. It looked almost exactly like the carving Otto had shown her last summer from that dead sapling near the old ranger tower. She brought the two side by side the next morning. Otto stared at the piece of bark in his hand, not speaking for a long while. Then he said, "He's not the only one, is he?" Sarah shook her head. Otto leaned against the post, his breath slow. "There was a time I thought I imagined it," he said. "But it looked just like him. Smaller, same hair, same hands, carved with a claw, or maybe a nail, like it meant something." He handed her back the piece. "They're not animals." Sarah didn't need convincing. That night, Echo mimicked the sound of the wind through the rain gutter, then switched to the exact melody of a robin's call from that morning. Then he paused and whispered, "Where's Sky go?" Sarah blinked. "What do you mean?" Echo tapped the tent ceiling, then pointed to the night. He wasn't copying. He was asking. Later, in sleep, he murmured something else. Words not yet shaped, but heavy with tone. And outside, just barely over the drone of the forest, came a deep, dragging thump. A sound that belonged to something with weight. Walking alone. Sarah didn't sleep. At dawn, Echo touched her hand and said, "You sad?" It wasn't mimicry. Not anymore. He reached up and placed a palm to her cheek. She didn't know what broke first, her voice or her heart. But somewhere, beyond the trees, something was listening, and it wasn't done waiting. The sky bruised itself quietly above the treetops, churning into deep grays and smoky purples that threatened rain but hadn't yet delivered. The air felt full, swollen with that particular tension the forest always seemed to know before people did. Sarah sat at the far end of the research tent with the journal open on her knees, the page already damp from her fingertips. Her pencil hovered, then dropped to the canvas floor. She wasn't drawing data. She was drawing ghosts. A man with short hair and tired eyes, drawn from memory too recent to fade. A little girl in a yellow sweater with one shoelace always undone. Her head thrown back in laughter, even in ink. The kind of laughter that came from the stomach, from the heart. The kind that used to echo in Sarah's ears when she couldn't sleep. Now it was back, Not in her head, not from memory, from Echo. It had started that morning, when she'd been boiling water over the little stove, and Echo had sat quietly beside the tent flap, watching the steam curl upward like he could hear stories inside it. He hadn't mimicked anything. Not the bubbling pot, not the zipper she tugged, not the rustle of her coat as she moved. Just silence. A long, unusual, deliberate silence. And then, from nowhere, that laugh. Perfectly pitched, perfectly placed. Exactly how her daughter had laughed the first time she'd seen snow fall. Sarah had spilled the water. She hadn't said a word, just stared, her face bone-white and raw around the edges. Echo had tilted his head, confused, and maybe a little hurt. She hadn't known what to say, so she didn't say anything at all. That afternoon, when the clouds sank lower and the wind picked up, Sarah pulled the journal from her pack and began to draw. It had always helped her before. Sketching made the world quieter, but now the silence felt different. It felt like something was watching her from the edge of a memory she wasn't ready to revisit. Echo came closer. She didn't notice at first. He moved like water, always barefoot, always careful not to disturb the earth beneath him. But when she looked up, his hand was inches from the page. His eyes weren't curious. They were solemn. He touched the drawing of the girl. His finger paused at the lines of her face. Then he looked up at Sarah, brow furrowed, voice barely a breath. "You sad?" She didn't move, couldn't speak. Echo watched her a moment longer, then reached out and placed his palm gently against her cheek. His skin was warm, softer than it looked. The gesture wasn't mimicry. It wasn't a copy. It was comfort. That was when she broke. Her breath hitched hard. She folded forward like something inside her had been snapped in half without warning. Her hands clutched at nothing. Her body shook so violently it frightened even her. And Echo, instead of pulling away, crawled into her lap. He pressed his forehead to hers and stayed there, silent, breathing slow. His arms wrapped around her neck, and she could feel his chest moving in time with hers. Not mirroring. Matching. Sarah hadn't cried in nearly a decade. Not when the doctors said there was nothing more they could do. Not at the funeral. Not when the crib was taken apart and left on the curb for some stranger to claim. But she cried now. For the first time she let it pour, and Echo held her. Outside, thunder rolled once, low and slow, like the forest was exhaling after holding its breath too long. The rain started soft, threading through the canopy before hitting the roof of the tent in scattered rhythm. Echo didn't flinch. He just whispered something she didn't catch, a syllable shaped like safety. Sarah pulled him closer, and for a moment, she didn't feel like a scientist. She didn't feel like a witness. She felt like a mother again. When night fell, the fire crackled low and the cold crept back in. Echo curled near the heat source, his limbs folded neatly under the old army blanket Sarah had dug out of the supply crate. She stayed up, staring at the tent wall. Not because she wasn't tired. She was. But because the quiet was louder now. It carried something. Then came the sound. Not thunder, not wind. It vibrated, long and deep, almost below hearing. A frequency more than a noise. Sarah felt it in her chest before she realized it was sound. Like something vast and old was calling out, not with words, but with presence. Echo bolted upright. His eyes went wide. His head turned sharply toward the forest, ears twitching in time with the pulse. He made a sound, not a word, but a whimper. Then he crawled across the tent and clung to Sarah's leg, burying his face against her. She didn't ask. She just wrapped her arms around him and listened. The sound came again, deeper, longer, then silence. Echo's shoulders shook. Sarah knew that kind of fear. It wasn't instinctual. It was remembered. She didn't sleep. In the morning, after the fire died down and the rain turned to mist, Sarah tried to distract Echo with drawing. She handed him the same piece of charcoal, pointed to the blank side of the bark, and smiled. He didn't draw. Instead, he whispered something again. This time, clearer, sharper. The syllables were familiar but wrong. Then he said it again, this time with more force. It was a name. Her daughter's name. Lila. The room fell out from under her. Sarah stood so fast the stool tipped. Echo stayed still, head bowed. She didn't ask him how. She didn't want to know. But deep down, she already did. Nev. The day she brought the muffins, when Echo had been repeating words to himself near the tent wall, Nev had heard. And among the words he'd echoed, one had come from her. A name spoken in casual grief, recalled in trembling memory. Echo hadn't just remembered it. He'd kept it. Sarah knelt, hands trembling, and pulled him close. She didn't speak. She just held him there, forehead to forehead, tears coming slow now, quieter. A wind picked up outside, high in the trees. Leaves rustled like whispers. When the sun finally pushed through the clouds around mid-morning, Sarah stepped outside, barefoot, jacketless. The cold didn't touch her. She stood there in the clearing, eyes fixed on the edge of the forest. A shadow moved in the trees. Not close, not near, but real. It wasn't shaped like a bear, and it didn't walk like one either. Back in town, Marshall sat on his roof with binoculars, scanning the tree line the way he did most days when he didn't feel like being inside. His dad's truck had left that morning. Gone hunting, gone silent. Marshall heard it too, that low sound. He leaned forward, one boot thudding softly on the shingles. The sound didn't come from the trees. It came from below them. He followed it with his eyes. Then something moved. Fast, dark. Not a shadow, not a deer, something upright. He nearly dropped the binoculars. Whatever it was heading toward the foothills. Toward the place people didn't go. Toward where Sarah had set up camp. He felt his stomach tighten. That night, Sarah zipped the tent without lighting the lamp. She didn't want the light to give them away. She didn't know what she was hiding from, but instinct told her to be still. Echo didn't sleep. He stayed close, hand curled tight around the collar of her coat. Then, right around midnight, she heard it again. The same sound, low, trembling, pulling, and this time, it didn't stop. It stayed, like something waiting for a response. Sarah's breath caught. Echo whispered her name. Then he whispered something else. Foot, big. She didn't know what to believe, but she believed him, and in the silence between heartbeats, she knew they weren't alone. By early fall, the forest had shifted its language. The light grew colder, thinner, filtered in slanted bands through a canopy starting to rust at the edges. Golds and ambers curled into the moss, and everything seemed to hold its breath a second longer. Sarah felt it before she heard it. That pull again, like the tree line itself was leaning in. Otto showed up unannounced. He did that sometimes. The man moved like he belonged to the trees more than to any town. His truck creaked to a halt just past the trailhead, tires crunching over wet gravel, radio off. He stepped out wearing a battered Carhartt jacket, field knife on one hip, and a thermos in one hand. Need to see something, was all he said. Sarah didn't argue. She zipped Echo inside the tent, told him to wait, whispered, "Stay quiet," and followed Otto into the woods. They moved without talking. Leaves crackled underfoot. Birds stilled. The further they went, the older the trees became. Towering trunks with bark like elephant skin. Limbs too high to see the ends. This wasn't part of the map trail system. Not anymore. Otto paused near a slope where the light barely touched the earth. He pointed. The mark was high, too high. A long, thick claw scrape, cut diagonally into a cedar trunk, over 10 feet up. The bark had curled back, fresh. Not from a bear. No bear stood that tall. And the angle was wrong. Deliberate. She stepped closer. "You ever seen that before?" Otto asked. She shook her head. He exhaled through his nose, slow. They mark paths, territory, maybe warnings, maybe just reminders. A little further on, another sign. A bent tree, not broken by wind. Snapped and twisted in a perfect arc, still alive, held down by a weight that was no longer there. A message written in a language nobody remembered how to read. Echo would have understood it. And when they reached the hollowed trunk of an ancient Douglas fir, Sarah stopped breathing. Something had slept there recently. Inside the gnarled belly of the tree was a thick patch of shed fur, coarse, reddish-brown, glinting faintly in the dim light, thicker than Echo's, twice the length. She reached for it without thinking, running her fingers through the fibers, still warm. Next to it, nestled in the roots, lay something stranger, a child's scarf, faded blue, edges frayed with time, embroidered by hand with a name barely legible now. Caleb. Otto stared at it, jaw clenched. Sarah turned. "You know that name?" He nodded. "Nev's grandson. Went missing here. 1968. Thought he'd wandered too far during a family hike. Whole town searched for days." She looked back at the scarf. No blood, no signs of violence. Just the scarf and the fur. Side by side like they'd been placed together on purpose. She didn't know what to feel. Relief? Horror? Otto crouched beside the trunk, picking at the moss with a stick. "You ever think maybe they don't take things to harm 'em?" He muttered. "Maybe they collect memories, like tokens." Sarah touched the bark, cold under her palm. "You think they tried to save him?" "I think no one ever asked." Back at camp, Echo was waiting exactly where she'd left him. He stared at her hands first, noticed the fur stuck to her coat. Then his eyes tracked the scarf. He didn't touch it, but something in his shoulders tightened, like a memory he couldn't quite explain had passed through him. Sarah held the scarf up. "Do you know this?" Echo blinked slowly, then, after a long pause, nodded once. Deliberate. Sad. That night Nev came by. She didn't bring muffins this time. She didn't smile. Just walked up the hill with a flashlight and an envelope in her coat pocket. Sarah met her halfway, already bracing. Nev didn't ask questions. She handed her the envelope, a photo creased and faded, of a 7-year-old boy with a bowl cut and that same scarf wrapped around his neck. "I had to be sure," she said, voice low. "Didn't want to believe it, but I felt it." She looked past Sarah toward the tent, where Echo's shadow moved softly behind the canvas. "He's not the one who took him." "No," Sarah said, voice steady. "But I don't think he was the first one to be lost either." Nev's fingers trembled. Then she said something Sarah didn't expect. Maybe they weren't trying to steal. Maybe they were trying to give back. They stood in silence for a while, the trees whispering things too old to translate. Somewhere far off, a nightbird cried once, then went quiet. Later, as the fog curled low through the pines, Sarah sat by the fire, the scarf folded neatly beside her, and Echo on the other side of the flames, humming a low, rhythmic tune. He wasn't copying. He was remembering. She didn't ask how he knew it. She just listened, because somehow she could tell it had belonged to someone once. Someone with hands smaller than hers and eyes wide with wonder. Someone who maybe hadn't been afraid when the forest reached out with open arms instead of claws. Echo looked at her and pointed toward the trees. "Home," he said softly. She didn't ask if he meant a place or a feeling. She already knew the answer. The next morning, Marshall showed up again. He looked shaken, pale. He kept glancing over his shoulder like something had followed him out of town. "There's talk," he said. Sarah folded her arms. "About what?" "About you, about something in the woods. My dad's saying it ain't just a bear out here." He hesitated, then blurted, "There's people asking questions." Sarah stiffened. "What people?" "Hunters, trappers, weirdos on Facebook groups. One guy's got a drone. Said he saw something moving like a man but with fur all down the back. Word spreading." Sarah didn't answer. Marshall looked toward the tent. Echo peeked out from behind the flap, wide-eyed but calm. "I didn't tell them," the boy said, almost defensively. "But they're coming anyway." Later that evening, as the wind picked up and leaves began to fall in earnest, Sarah unzipped her journal and added a single line at the bottom of the page. "The forest doesn't hide secrets. It holds them until we're ready to listen." Then she closed the book, turned toward the tent where Echo slept soundly for now, and whispered the truth into the firelight. "I hear you. But the trees," they already knew. The trees had started dropping their leaves in earnest. Not the lazy drifting kind you see in postcards, but full sheddings, wet, sudden, and noisy. They rained down in brown spirals that carpeted the forest floor with a hush that made footsteps harder to track and easier to imagine. It was the kind of autumn that made every branch sound like a breath, every distant crack a whisper meant only for you. Sarah followed Marshall through the timberline, in near silence. He was nervous. She could tell by the way his hoodie sleeves were pulled halfway over his hands, fidgeting with the threads. He kept glancing behind him as if afraid of something he hadn't yet named out loud. The trail he led her down was old, overgrown in parts, but familiar, like a path someone once made in panic and never intended to take again. They reached the site before noon, a shallow hollow in the hillside, covered in pine needles, still damp. Broken ferns bent toward the center in every direction. At first glance, it looked like nothing. But Sarah knew what to look for now. There were drag marks, long ones, muddied and half erased by rain, but clear once you trained your eyes. Something had been pulled through here. Something heavy. Marshall crouched, brushing aside a layer of moss. Blood. Not much, but enough to stain the soil. Wasn't human, he said, trying to sound certain. Looked like deer blood or elk, but there were prints. Huge ones. Sarah said nothing. He cleared his throat. I didn't tell anyone because I thought maybe it was a bear or something, but I came back yesterday. The smell was still here, like fur and something rotted. She looked at him then. And? He swallowed hard. 2 days before you found Echo, I saw something. His voice cracked a little, but he pushed through. I was walking home after cutting through the ridge trail. Took a shortcut like I always do. And I saw it. Her, I think. Big. Taller than my dad. Covered in fur, but hunched over. She was fighting something. Sarah stepped closer. Fighting? Yeah. He nodded quickly. There was this bear, huge, black, snarling like crazy. The big one shoved Echo behind a stump and just charged. She didn't even make noise. She just went at it. He paused, breath catching. I ran. I didn't mean to. I should have stayed. Should have done something, but I just froze, and then I bolted. The confession cracked open something raw in his chest. His shoulders trembled, even as he tried to hide it. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking, maybe if I'd stayed, maybe she'd still... He didn't finish. Sarah crouched beside the trail of prints, placing her hand inside one of the large depressions in the mud. It swallowed her fingers whole. She fought to save him, she said, more to herself than to him. And you saw it. Marshall looked up. You believe me? Yes, she said simply, because you're not the first. That night as they returned to the tent, Otto was waiting. He leaned against the stump near the fire pit, arms folded, steam curling up from the metal thermos clutched in his hands. He didn't speak until Marshall had gone to grab water from the stream, and Echo had curled up inside the tent with his face to the canvas wall. Otto tilted his head. I was 23 when I saw her. Back then I still had the badge, the pickup, the optimism. He half smiled. I thought I'd stumbled on something dangerous, something that needed managing. Sarah sat down across from him, quiet. She wasn't attacking anyone. She was shielding a little one, just like you described. He took a long breath. We'd had reports of cattle going missing. My partner thought it was a cougar. I thought it was teenagers messing around. Until I saw her. And then everything I thought I knew got real quiet, Sarah whispered. What happened to the little one? Otto looked away. Didn't survive. The silence that followed wasn't sad. It was reverent. Grief spoken in the language of grown men who'd failed to stop a thing they didn't understand. He pulled something from his coat, a worn piece of wood, carved with delicate lines, notches around the edge like counting marks. The center bore the shape of a broken circle, unfinished. She was making this, Otto said, holding it like a relic. I found it later. Took me years to realize it wasn't random. Sarah reached for her bag and slowly pulled out Echo's own carving. Otto's eyes narrowed as he took it. Compared them side by side, the shapes, the grain, the language. "They match," she said. "Same pressure, same rhythm in the cuts." He nodded slowly. "They're not just like us. They are us. Just older. In ways we forgot how to be." Later that night, Echo stood at the edge of the firelight. He hadn't spoken in hours. He touched the bark carving gently, then turned his eyes to the horizon where the trees swallowed the sky. Then he pointed to the cliffs beyond the valley, the jagged edge that caught the first light of morning and the last light of dusk. "Home," he said. Not wistful, not begging. Statement of fact. Sarah followed his finger. "You want to go back?" He looked at her, then touched his chest, then hers, then back at the mountain. She didn't need translation. Somewhere in those cliffs was where he'd been taken from, or where he'd been left, and he was ready. At the bottom of the hill, in the dark cover of the trees, a shadow moved against the wind. Not loud, not close, but there. Sarah barely caught the sound. A breath. A step too heavy to be deer, too measured to be a bear. She didn't alert the others, not yet. Instead, she walked to the edge of the trees and listened. Nev came the next day, eyes sunken, face drawn. She stood beside Sarah for a long time, both of them watching Echo shape a circle in the dirt with a stick. "I kept thinking maybe my Caleb had just wandered off," Nev said softly. "Maybe the cold got him. Maybe he fell." She blinked hard. "But what if he didn't fall? What if he was carried?" Sarah placed a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't lose him. You were just never meant to keep him." Nev exhaled, a long breath that sounded like years releasing. That evening, as the light faded and the cold crept in, the wind brought something new. A sound, low and deep, vibrating against the spine, not the ears. Echo froze. His eyes widened. Then he stepped toward the forest edge, drawn. Sarah stepped in front of him. But he looked up at her, calm. "Not bad," he said. Then he whispered something she hadn't heard before. A name. Not in English. But it sounded like a name you'd sing, not shout. And somewhere, beyond the trees, something answered. One long, mournful call. Like a mother. Sarah didn't cry, but her breath hitched. Marshall stared into the woods, pale. "We're not alone out here," he said. Sarah placed her hand on Echo's shoulder, grounding him. "No," she replied. "We never were." The first snow didn't fall like a promise. It came like a quiet warning. Fat, wet flakes dropped slow but steady through the skeletal trees, landing on tarp, pine needles, the backs of hands. The kind of snow that didn't stick yet but made everything feel colder than it should. The kind that told you winter wasn't just coming. It was already here. Sarah stood outside the tent, arms wrapped around herself. Her breath came in short white clouds, fading fast in the dim air. The fire had died. Echo hadn't spoken all day. He just stared into the trees, lips slightly parted, like he was listening for something he couldn't explain. She knew that look. The deep listening. The knowing something was out there without needing proof. He was waiting, and whatever was calling him was getting closer. The nights had been restless for days. Echo tossing in his sleep, whispering things that didn't belong to this side of the world. Strange syllables, old shapes of sound. And always, just before dawn, that vibration would come. Low, slow, bone deep. Not heard. Felt. A call. A summons. And now Echo was slipping. He didn't mimic anymore. He didn't laugh. He didn't play with the radio or ask for wah-wah. He just watched the forest with wide, dark eyes. Waiting. Deciding. That night, the wind howled low through the tree line, and she finally heard it. Not imagined this time. Footsteps. Distant, heavy. Too heavy for deer. Too purposeful for storm wind. Sarah zipped the tent shut. She kept her hand on the hunting knife tucked beneath her sleeping bag, not because she'd use it, just because it made her feel less helpless. Echo lay beside her, silent, unmoving. At some point, without her noticing, he fell asleep sitting up, head tilted toward the flap. And when she woke at first light, he was gone. The flap was still zipped, but the edge of it had been loosened from underneath, just enough for a body his size to slip through. Snow had started to stick. She followed the footprints, bare, small, spaced evenly, leading straight into the thick of the trees. Then beside them, another set, enormous, deep. She didn't call for him, didn't scream. If he was answering a call, shouting his name wouldn't bring him back. But she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat, the emergency radio, and her flashlight, and went after him. The trail moved fast, too fast, like Echo wasn't hesitating anymore. By the time she reached the ridge trail, the snow was falling sideways. Visibility dropped. Branches slapped at her face and arms. Somewhere behind her, something snapped, loud and sharp. Not a twig, a tree. She spun but saw nothing. That's when she noticed Marshall's boot prints veering off the main trail. The dumb kid had followed her. Panic rose sharp and hot. She turned and backtracked, eyes scanning the half-blurred prints. They doubled back twice, then led downhill, toward the old logging cut, and then nothing. No more steps. Just a patch of disturbed snow, his glove, and silence. She called his name once. No answer. Then again, louder. Still nothing. The third time, her voice cracked. She found him half buried under a pine bough, shaking, cheeks red with cold. His lips blue. He looked up at her with wild, glassy eyes. I thought I saw him. I didn't mean to. Shut up and breathe, she snapped, wrapping her arms around him. You're lucky you didn't freeze. He buried his face in her shoulder. When she pulled him upright, the snow had thickened into a sheet. She could barely see the trees 20 feet ahead. She had to make a decision. Radio the center. They'd deploy choppers, search dogs, thermal cams. And Echo would be treated like something strange, studied, poked, contained. Or go deeper alone. She tightened her grip on the boy's coat. Stay with me, she said. He nodded, teeth chattering. They moved north, following the deeper set of tracks now. Whatever was leading Echo wasn't hiding anymore. Otto met them halfway up the slope. His coat was dusted with snow, and his old .30-30 rifle was slung over one shoulder. I figured, he said simply. He didn't ask what happened. He just pointed toward the split ridge, where the trees thinned out and the snow turned strangely untouched. Sarah paused, then asked the question no one had said out loud. What else is in the woods tonight? Otto didn't flinch. Not just them. He knelt, swept aside a patch of snow with the back of his glove. Long, jagged claw marks. Not clean like Bigfoot. Crude. Messy. Boar? Marshall whispered. Too high, Otto said. Too wide. Sarah stared at the gouges. Bear! Otto nodded. Big, probably starving. Might have picked up the trail same time we did. Sarah's stomach turned. Echo's out there, she said. I know. The wind shifted. And with it, a cry. Not Echo's, but something else. Not human. Not quite animal either. A noise so full of depth it seemed to curve around her bones. They ran. Up the ridge. Through underbrush. Snow slicing past their faces. And then, just past a break in the trees. Movement. Huge. Not the bear. Two figures. Tall. Upright. Coated in thick fur that shimmered under the muted sky. One bent low. The other stood guard, wide and motionless. Between them, Echo. Still. He turned when he saw Sarah, eyes wide. Then something behind him moved. A black mass crashed through the trees. Low to the ground, teeth bared, steam pouring from its nostrils. The bear. It roared, charging. Sarah didn't think. She lunged toward Marshall, shoving him down. Then time broke apart. The taller figure, Bigfoot male, moved in a blur. Not away, toward the sound. He met the bear mid-stride, arms out. The collision sounded like thunder snapping a tree in two. Fur, snow, and noise tumbled across the forest floor in a chaotic blur. Growls, screams. Then silence. When the snow settled, the bear was gone, dragged off, limp. The tall figure stood over the clearing, chest rising heavy, shoulders heaving, and Echo ran back to Sarah. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her coat. The other figure, female, approached slowly, carefully. She knelt beside Echo, rested one hand on his back, then looked at Sarah. No threat, just gratitude. Then she did something Sarah didn't expect. She reached behind her, pulled a thick clump of her own fur, and laid it at Sarah's feet. An offering, or maybe recognition. Sarah blinked through tears. Marshall whispered, "Are we supposed to bow or something?" "No," she said. "Just be quiet." The figures turned. Snow swallowed their shapes. Echo stayed in Sarah's arms, his breath steady now, but she could feel it. He'd been found, and she was no longer sure if she should hold on or start learning how to let go. The blizzard had not let up in 12 hours. What had started as a curtain of slow-falling snow had thickened into a wall. Trees vanished 10 feet ahead. Sound folded inward. Even breath felt muffled, like the world had sunk beneath something vast and white and slow-moving. In that kind of cold, sound didn't echo. It was swallowed. Sarah moved through it with boots she could no longer feel, and a flashlight beam that barely reached past her gloves. Behind her, Marshall was quiet. The boy hadn't spoken in nearly an hour. He just followed, one hand resting lightly against her backpack strap, not for guidance, but to be sure they were still tethered. They were halfway up the incline past the timberline now, the air thinner, meaner. Somewhere behind them, Otto's footsteps carved a deeper path through the drifts, steady as a metronome. He hadn't spoken either, but the glint of metal under his coat told Sarah he was ready. For anything. Echo had gone ahead of them sometime just before dawn. Not alone. Never alone. That was the strangest part. He hadn't run in fear. He'd walked into the woods like someone returning to church after a long, silent war with faith. And the others, the ones who had come for him, they had led him. The storm gave them cover. But Sarah could feel eyes in the trees. Not the kind that watched with threat. The kind that watched with memory. Something out here remembered her. And it was deciding. Otto paused near a fallen tree half buried in ice and knelt, brushing aside the powder with a leather-gloved hand. "Tracks," he said. 2, maybe 3. Sarah dropped beside him. The indentations were spaced wide. Too wide. Whatever made them didn't walk like people. They didn't follow straight lines. They curved, circled, paused, almost protective. Then, just ahead, the wind shifted. The clearing opened like a gasp. There they were, silhouettes. 3 of them, standing upright, still, 2 larger than any man she'd ever seen. 7, maybe 8 feet, covered in dense fur that rippled in the wind like animal hides caught on firelight. Not shaggy, not grotesque, just enormous, wild and ancient and calm. Between them, smaller, was Echo. He stood with one hand resting against the larger figure's leg, like a child reunited with a parent at the edge of a crowd. But he wasn't hiding. His eyes were fixed on Sarah. He wasn't asking for help. He was asking for understanding. Sarah stepped forward, slowly. Otto didn't stop her. Marshall held his breath. The wind paused. Then the tallest figure moved. It wasn't a threat. It was a step forward, deliberate, measured. In its hand, a piece of fur, long, coarse, the same shade as Echo's, but streaked with gray near the ends. It didn't hand it to her. It laid it on the snow at her feet. A gesture. Sarah's hands trembled. The female, shorter but no less powerful, knelt beside Echo, one hand gently smoothing the snow off his shoulders. No words, no sounds, just an expression that didn't need translation. She was his mother. Echo looked over his shoulder, back at Sarah. Then he smiled, soft, half-lit, but not sad. That's when the ground shook. Low at first, then again, harder. Something thundered through the woods behind them. Not upright, not two-legged, 4. And angry. The bear, the same massive creature they had encountered days ago, now driven mad by hunger and the scent of blood and smoke. It crashed through the trees with a snarl that sent birds screaming into the sky. Sarah stepped back instinctively, drawing Marshall behind her. But before she could call out, Echo's father moved. Fast. Too fast for something that size. He stepped in front of the group, arms wide. The bear didn't slow. The two met in the center of the clearing with a sound that cracked the silence open like a bone. Fur tore. Teeth snapped. The ground erupted in powder and blood. Otto raised his rifle, but Echo stepped in front of it. No. Just one word. Firm, final. Otto lowered the barrel. The bear roared again, lunging. Sarah moved, grabbing Marshall as he lost his footing. The boy's boots slipped, sending him sprawling toward the ice. She dove, tackled him sideways, slid across the frozen surface, head slamming into a drift. Everything blurred. Then a blur of fur. A massive hand. The Bigfoot father drove the bear sideways with a shoulder, crashing into a tree that split down the center. It didn't kill the bear, but it drove it off. The creature limped into the woods, bleeding, growling. The Bigfoot stayed where he stood, panting, chest heaving. His eyes flicked once to Sarah, then to Echo. Then he knelt, and for the first time, bowed his head. Not in submission, in acknowledgement. Sarah's knees buckled. The wind howled overhead. Trees swayed. Echo walked toward her, slow, measured. He took her hand, placed it against his chest, then said, "Safe," Sarah whispered. "You came back." He nodded. Then he pointed at the others. "Family." His mother stepped forward, laid her hand over his, then over Sarah's. No words, but everything spoken. Then, from behind them, Otto coughed. They turned. He was holding Marshall steady. The boy's eyes were wide, but not with fear, with wonder. The figures turned to go. Echo hesitated. Sarah looked down. "You have to go." He didn't answer, just hugged her, fierce, fast, then broke away. His mother waited, patient. He ran to her, and together, they disappeared into the trees. The wind carried their movement like music you only hear once, but never forget. Sarah stood in the clearing long after the snow stopped, long after the clouds began to thin. She wasn't sure how long they stood there, but when she finally turned to Otto and Marshall, something had shifted in her bones. She'd come to the mountain to study life. Instead, life had studied her, and what it showed her, she'd never write down. Some truths don't belong in notebooks. They belong in the spaces between trees, in footprints too wide for boots, in moments when silence becomes the loudest kind of answer. The sky cracked open with gold, and the forest, once again, began to breathe. Spring came quietly that year. It didn't announce itself with blossoms or bright skies. It arrived in whispers, snowmelt dripping through old gutters, streams waking up beneath the ice, the hush of wind carrying pine needles instead of frost. The forest didn't cheer. It exhaled. Sarah sat on the cabin porch, pen in hand, coffee gone cold beside her. The old composition notebook lay open on her knee, its pages filled not with scientific observation or data points, but the kind of sentences you wrote when no one was watching. Notations to memory, to truth. I saw something the world would never believe, and I let it go. The log walls behind her were warm from the sun. A bluebird fluttered between fence posts. Somewhere, the creek was running again. She hadn't written for weeks, not since the snow cleared, not since Echo vanished back into the forest. He hadn't said goodbye. He hadn't needed to. But even now, when she passed the mirror in the hallway, she caught herself checking for the shadow of a small hand behind her shoulder. Otto had gone silent too. The kind of silence not rooted in fear or mystery, but in respect. He spent most days up near the ridgeline, working on a new fire tower restoration with no real plans to finish it. Marshall came by sometimes, quieter now, asking better questions. Nev still left jars of apple butter on Sarah's porch without knocking. Life didn't go back to normal. It rewrote what normal meant, and Sarah let it. Until one morning in the second week of May, the knock came. Not on the door. At the edge of the tree line, she stood in the open doorway, hand still on her mug, breath held in that strange way a child does when they think they've imagined something too beautiful to be real. He stood there, older, taller, Not by much, but enough. Echo's fur was longer now, darker around the shoulders, his eyes more steady. He had a calmness to him that hadn't been there before, a quiet certainty in how he held himself. His hands didn't twitch. His feet didn't shuffle. He wasn't mimicking anymore. He was choosing every move. Sarah stepped down the porch steps slowly, not trusting her voice. He reached out, not to touch, not yet, but to show something in his palm. A stone, small, perfectly smooth, painted with a stripe of ochre across the center. She knew what it meant. He was inviting her. She didn't ask where. She just nodded once and grabbed her coat. The hike took hours, not the path they'd taken before. This time, Echo led her deeper, past where the maps ran out, and the ridgelines twisted back on themselves like folded pages. The trees grew thicker, older, their roots tangled in rock and time. She didn't speak. Neither did he. Just after noon, they crested a narrow pass. The air changed, warmer, sweeter. Below them, tucked between the cliffs and the river, was a valley. It pulsed with green, not like the rest of the forest. This place, it breathed. Birds circled overhead. Small clearings shimmered with morning mist that hadn't burned off yet. At the center, built into the stone and moss and earth, were dwellings, half hidden, half grown. Not structures, not caves. Homes, some small, some wide. Some shaped like fallen tree trunks, others tucked between boulders, cloaked in fern. Movement drifted through them. Silent, barely seen. Not one, not two. A community. Sarah stopped breathing. They weren't legends. They were here, living together in peace. And they had brought her in. Echo touched her elbow gently, led her down the slope. No one ran. No one watched her like an outsider. They simply existed around her. Children darting between branches. Adults kneeling over water to rinse fruit. One elderly male weaving something from long grass. Eyes crinkled with age and something close to kindness. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, and that seemed enough. They reached a small open space, ringed with stones in a loose spiral. Echo motioned for her to sit. She did. Across the circle, an older female, broad-shouldered, eyes deep, approached with something in her hand. A compass. Worn, scratched. She held it out. Sarah blinked. That's Marshall's. The woman placed it in her hand, closed Sarah's fingers around it, then nodded once. No words, no ceremony, just the simple, powerful act of returning something that had been lost. Sarah turned the compass over. The initials carved into the back. JMD, Marshall's grandfather's compass, the one he'd lost years ago during a storm. She whispered, "You kept it." Echo nodded. They keep what matters. Later, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of tarnished gold, Echo walked with her to the edge of the valley again. They stood in silence. Then he turned, touched his chest, then hers, then spoke. Family, both. 3 words, carved from something deeper than language. Sarah bent slightly, forehead touching his. Tears came without shame. "I'll keep your secret," she said. He smiled. Not wide, not for show, but with something final in it. Not the end, but a knowing. They walked back as far as the clearing. Then he stopped, didn't say goodbye, just turned toward the trees. He didn't look back, and neither did she. Back at the cabin, she sat at her desk. The journal lay open, blank page glowing under the lamp. She picked up the pen, then put it down, closed the book, and slid it into the drawer. Some stories don't belong in print. Some truths can't be measured or cataloged. Some lives live better in silence. When the ranger station called a week later asking if she had anything to report, she simply said, "Nothing unusual, just the usual deer, bear, winter runoff." And that was that. The forest for now would stay quiet. The valley would remain untouched, and Sarah would carry the weight and wonder of it with her. Not as a burden, but as a gift. Because some sacred things don't survive exposure. They survive in trust. In the end, maybe it's not about what we find in the forest, but what the forest finds in us. There are places in this world that exist just beyond the noise. Places where silence holds memory, where the wind still carries stories, and where time walks slower so that grief and healing can catch up to each other. And maybe, just maybe, there are lives living quietly between the shadows, not waiting to be discovered, but watching to see if we are still capable of kindness. Because what we choose not to take, not to chase, not to expose, says something about who we are. Some truths ask not to be proven, but to be protected. What we often call wild is not always dangerous. What we call strange is not always separate. There are ways of being we've forgotten, ways rooted in trust, in shared silence, in the sacred act of simply being there for another life, without needing to possess or define it. There is a language older than speech, one that lives in the way we protect something that cannot speak for itself, the way we soften when something fragile reaches toward us, the way we choose empathy even when we're afraid. And sometimes the most human thing we can do is to meet mystery with mercy. The deepest truths aren't shouted. They're whispered in the quiet moments, passed hand to hand like memory stones, or carved into the air with the gentle touch of a farewell. And when the moment comes to let go, what matters most is how we remember. So if this story stayed with you, not just in your mind, but in that quiet corner of your heart where belief still lives, then maybe it was never really just about mystery. Maybe it was about remembering how to listen. Thank you for walking this path with us. We'd love to hear what it stirred in you, what you felt, what you questioned, what you remembered. Drop a comment below, share your thoughts, and if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to the channel and join our growing circle of believers in compassion, in connection, and in the quiet, powerful truth that some stories are worth protecting, even when no one's watching. Because the forest is always listening, and kindness is never wasted.